Hi, I'm Glenn Hurst. I'm chair of the Iowa Democratic Party Rural Caucus. Thank you for joining us for our forum, Rural Schools Big Concerns, where we take a look at Iowa education. Margaret is a partner at Iowa School Finance Information Service. It's a consulting firm that provides financial and training services to Iowa school districts. Among her responsibilities is ISFIS, including lobbying, public policy development and analysis for the Urban Education Network of Iowa. She's a professional advocate for the Rural School Advocates of Iowa, now close to 125 school districts participating. Margaret is a Des Moines Public School, Hoover High School graduate, all right, and received a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Northwestern University in Speech Communications with areas of concentration in economics and sociology. Margaret is a fiscal analyst with the Iowa Legislative Fiscal Bureau, where she staffed various appropriations committees. Margaret served as a Des Moines Public School board member and is currently at the Drake Head Start Advisory Committee, focusing on budget and federal compliance issues. I wanted to share each and every one of those things because it is an expert that we have with us, and that's who we should be taking our lead from. So with that, Margaret, why don't you should have the ability to share your screen, and why don't you go ahead and start us off?
You bet. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you and your audience tonight. You know, it's interesting. I was just working with a school board meeting in an urban district on my way to the hotel here and ran a little late. So I apologize. Part of the delay might have been because I wasn't here early to get on. But we were just discussing the things that rural and urban districts have in common. And a couple of those things include extreme poverty, service deserts, you know, the inability to get services to where students are, and the strong need to have the most qualified, capable staff and difficulty attracting them when there aren't enough resources. And I think that when we're talking about rural schools in particular, making sure that they have enough resource so they can give every student access to not just the curriculum that's required by law, but the thing that's going to really help that student find their passion and be successful when they graduate and go on to whatever happens after high school. And so I wanted to start out tonight to really talk about the resource debate and then how that has, the history of school finance in the last 10 years or so has disadvantaged all schools, but rural schools in particular. This shows the history of the school funding formula in Iowa. And since it was created back in the 1970s, every piece of data here is the percent increase in the per pupil cost. And although they call it a cost, it's really the per pupil revenue that's available to school districts. And since it's per pupil, rural schools may already be at a disadvantage because if they only have a dozen students in the first grade, they don't have the same economy of scale to have enough money generated from those students to adequately pay the first grade teacher that needs to be there to teach them. But it's a per pupil amount, and anybody can notice this trend line without seeing too much difficulty here, that back in the 80s, we were as high as 13.5%. Prior to 1992, there was an automatic pilot or an indicator of that increase based on economic conditions. What an amazing idea to think about what is the inflationary cost of goods that have to be provided to school districts, what's the cost of labor, what's the cost of insurance benefits and those kinds of things that are necessary, but also what's happening in the economy, like the growth in property values in the community. And that calculation spit out an automatic factor. We hit 1993, the state budget was in trouble. Governor Branstad was governor in one of his earlier terms at that point. They had to raise a fifth penny of sales tax in order to balance the budget. And they said at that time that school aid, this will be a good indicator for some of you how old you are. It was Pac-Manning the state budgets. You remember that Pac-Man that went around and ate the fruit. So they were concerned that they couldn't keep up with that pace of having a formula driven by economic indicators, which was our first error, I think, in deciding that schools were potentially not the priority. Then we get fast forward to 2002, 2003, another decline in the economy. And you'll see what happened there. We dropped to a 1% increase in the cost per student, 2 years of 2%, bounced back up to 4 for a while and then went down to 0. There's an orange band that I hope is visible in the screen share that's between 3 and 4%. And we call that the cost of doing the business of school. If you have no change in enrollment and you're trying to maintain everything that you're doing at a status quo level and pay for the cost increases that schools experience, which are slightly different than the consumer price index because the cost of labor and benefits is higher than that, you need 3 to 4%. And in 10 of the last 11 years, the legislature has set that cost per pupil below the cost of doing the business of school. So you think about students who 11 years ago were in kindergarten, they're starting their junior year in high school, and they've only had 1 year out of that whole time when their school board and their district actually had enough resource to keep doing what they were doing. So schools have had to become incredibly efficient. Every school board, whether you're growing or declining enrollment, has had conversations about what are we not going to do anymore? What programs can we not do? How do we attract and retain quality staff and fill positions? What positions do we not fill? And then you have that lens of thinking about rural schools in particular. Now, the one economic benefit that rural schools have is they tend to attract young teachers because teachers have to start somewhere, and school districts that are more urban in nature or suburban districts may be able to attract teachers that require a year or two of experience. So our rural districts will get new teachers. They don't pay quite as much for those teachers because they're new in their career. They invest a lot in them for professional development. And then a job opens up in another place and we lose them. So we have some rural school districts that kind of serve as the training ground for teachers in Iowa. But it's really hard to build that long-term quality staff if you're constantly having that turnover that happens. There is no adjustment in the funding formula for sparsity in Iowa, although we have other states in the country that have something like that. Our formula doesn't acknowledge that. Our formula only recently, in the last 3 years, acknowledged transportation costs that were extraordinary, that were above the statewide average. And that's really been a help to some of our rural districts with excessive transportation costs. But there's still a gap in the difference available for many of our rural districts. Then you combine this decline in the amount per student with declining enrollment, and it really is a double whammy. And I know we've seen that in a lot of our rural communities where we have, we used to have farms with 10 kids on them, and now we have fewer farms and they have fewer children. So the economics of population change has impacted the ability to have that economy of scale necessary to get our rural schools everything that they need really to meet the needs of students. Now, what rural schools do have, which is great, is they have great relationships with students. When you have fewer students per class, the teacher is able to carry that load in a less burdensome way and can sometimes even individualize instruction better. We've got many of our rural school districts with 100% graduation rate, which is fabulous. There are no cracks to fall through. So that's a celebration. The Rural School Advocates of Iowa in the last 3 or 4 years has worked really hard to expand course offerings and different ways to meet accreditation requirements so we can get that good content to students. But, that's not a panacea. We don't, like in this time of COVID, we don't want all of our students to be 100% online, although we're doing it in some places now for safety. That's not a long-term plan for sustainability for good instruction for our kids. So having a course or two virtually to meet accreditation requirements maybe. And I do see the value of having some learning online because that's how I as an adult learn now in a lot of ways. That's okay. That is, however, a challenge. And part of that challenge is just the geographic nature of internet connections. And that's another difficulty for our rural districts. We have some places where there just isn't sufficient bandwidth or there's no connection at all for staff and students to be able to do the online learning that's necessary to keep everybody safe, or necessary to connect them to content that they can get somewhere else. And that has to be a priority, I think, of our future state legislature. I know the federal government is working on it, but it's just such small amounts based on the need. I think of the internet now, if it's the information superhighway, it really is a public utility that all of our students need access to. Not just our students, but their families. If they have to get help from workforce development by going online, how can they do that without an internet connection? I had a great story of a school district that was talking about connecting their kids last spring during the first COVID closure, and a student was taking an AP class test that had to be done online, and his internet capacity in his house was not sufficient. So he went out to the tractor because the GPS on the tractor had a stronger bandwidth than what he had in the house. And, you know, that's what we do in rural schools and rural communities. We make it work. We find a way. We know some folks are driving to the parking lot of the school where they may have a router so they can connect. But we really have to make an effort to get everybody access to the information superhighway for them to be successful in the future. So I mentioned transportation, I mentioned the internet, and then the general funding issue in attracting and retaining quality teachers. And it is unfathomable to me that some people think that market economics do not apply to education. And, you know, I look back when my mother had to make a choice about what profession she was going to be in, there weren't a lot of choices for women. And now women can do everything. So, you know, 40 years ago, we had a captive audience of great labor. But if we don't pay market competitive wages for the profession of teaching, then people will choose to go into any of other public service professions, like being a doctor or an accountant or an attorney, where they can make a living and make a life. And we have to be able to have that competitive market wage if we want to attract people into the field of education and then keep them and reward them for the hard work that they do. In the rural community, it's even harder, because as these young people come out of college, you know, they're used to having access to amenities that may not exist in rural communities. So we have to make up for that with relationships, and that can be a challenge to do. Then lastly, I just wanted to talk about mental health and rural poverty and how that's an issue that's impacting our students and our staff. And we have to figure out how to connect those kids to resources, and we don't have enough social workers either. Same story. You know, I could just hit replay on what I just said about teachers, but there are new efforts in connecting students virtually through telehealth to counseling and those kinds of things. And that may fill a little bit of a void, but that's not going to be for every student, every parent, every even staff member that may need to have some mental health support. And then I'm going to save the whole COVID conversation for later when we get to questions, because there's probably a lot to say about that too. But to me, that's the general picture of elevating expectations, which we've done, and connecting students to more advanced content. And all the meanwhile, we're struggling with continually diminishing resource base.
Well, Margaret, you really made some important points that I want to make sure that was clear to everyone. And I think one of the first things out of your mouth was so important. I grabbed a pencil and pen and wrote it down. And it's one that we forget all the time, that there is an ally and a relationship in rural and urban inner city advocates, that we see the need for services that are absent, really paralleled in those communities. Whether that's education or that the area I come from is healthcare, that there's just we have an opportunity to find some common ground and work with some people together in those areas. I wanted to clarify what you said about the budget being, the budget is behind the cost of doing business for our schools at this time. We currently have a budget that's fine. Okay, I got that was clear. And the formula that we're using to determine that budget, is there a cost of living adjustment on that, or is that just straight?
So, yeah, since 1993, the legislature has had to enact that increase in the percent per student. So it's become a legislative debate. And for a period of years, it was done a whole year in advance, so schools had more time to plan. Now it's done within 30 days of the release of the governor's budget. So if the governor gets the budget out in January, hopefully by the end of February, you know how much money schools are going to have July 1st. But they're already up against publication deadlines, because they have to decide that budget by April 15th, and you backdate all of the requirements of that. Sometimes they're making decisions about the budget without the knowledge of how much money they're going to have.
And just a quick question on that per diem, and then I'm going to go to Mike, and then we'll have a conversation. But I just can't stop. The per diem rate per student, does that change based on grade level of the expected students, or is it so? So then the question is it more expensive to teach a first and second grader, or is it more expensive to teach a junior or senior?
Oh, that's a good question, and the answer is yes. So it depends, right?
Okay.
So it depends. The most expensive cost for first grade or for a senior is the cost of the staff involved in delivering that content, and the age of the staff and the experience of the staff, and whether or not they have a master's degree or other things that might qualify them for higher pay. All of those things matter in determining the cost for any individual grade or any individual student. However, if you look at most of the data, elementary school tends to be a little less expensive than high school because of the programmatic requirements at high school, and the elevated levels of staff, more master's degree teachers or requirements. College credit courses cost more. Some of those do have weightings in the formula associated with those costs, as do certain students. Like there's more of the per diem for special ed students based on what's needed to meet their needs in their individual education plan, or English language learner kids. So there are some adjustments in the formula that are student based. The only thing that I think really references the grade level gets to the extra weighting, the supplementary weighting for college level courses where they get concurrent enrollment credit. But other than that, it's not really, we don't spend exactly that much on every student. That number times the students generates the big pot, and then the school board decides how are we best going to allocate those resources.
The reason I asked is I think about a community that's growing and having young families that are having babies and kids growing up and coming through elementary, that might be a more robust pot of money per diem that could then go to those higher need, that's spread out to those higher need students, juniors, seniors, knowing that population is going to age into it and they'll get theirs when the next population comes along. But if we've stopped growing and you've got this expensive set of students without any hope of new revenue coming in, that might affect it. Well, let's get Mike in this conversation now. He's got to be chomping at the bit. Mike Beranek is a veteran of classroom teacher. He is currently on release from Western Hills Elementary in West Des Moines, as he serves as the president of the Iowa State Education Association, ISEA, which is the largest teachers union representing thousands of members across the state. Mike's a member of the Commission on Education Leadership and Compensation, Iowa Department of Education State Assessment Committee, Iowa Department Teacher of the Year Selection Committee, and serves on the Comprehensive State Network Region 9 Board. Mike was the proud recipient of the Disney American Teacher Award for 2001. Congratulations. Being cited for his innovative classroom projects and activities. Mike received his Bachelor of Science in Early Childhood Education with preschool from Iowa State University in 1984, and a Bachelor of Education in Elementary Education at Iowa State University in 1988. Mike, why don't you kind of tell us what's the most important things we should be paying attention to?
Well, thank you, Glenn, for inviting me, and I'd just like to send a shout out to Vicki Ross-Sanders. She's a strong advocate down in Southwest Iowa, and she was a longtime colleague of mine in West Des Moines. And Pat Shipley, who happens to be on here this evening, she was one of my union sisters who taught me a lot of what I needed to learn in my early years. As Glenn had mentioned, I taught in West Des Moines, and I'm still employed there. However, I grew up in Southeast Iowa, and I went to school in a town called Washington, but I lived in the country north of Washington, and my address was Riverside. And so I have a strong background in rural education, and I believe it truly is the backbone of Iowa. And so I think we need to take deep pride in what our educators are doing in our rural communities, particularly during this time of the pandemic. All of our educators are working incredibly hard, whether they're a classroom associate, a classroom teacher, an administrator, and school boards. They're all looking to make sure that our students are learning and growing, and they're doing the best that they can, and they're working way beyond the contract day. I can sit and I can listen to Margaret Buckton talk all night long because I learned something new from her every night I listen to her when we're on these Zooms. However, tonight she took a lot of my talking points, so I will do the best to kind of elaborate on some of the things that she mentioned. But rural education in Iowa is at a crossroads, I believe. And I'm just going to put it simply. Elections do matter, folks. And the financing issues that Margaret brought up are incredibly important. And our elected officials need to understand the need for resources in our communities. There has been a shift the past few years to reduce state revenue, and by doing that, by providing property tax relief. And that directly affects the amount of monies that go into our schools. When there's less revenue at the state level, there's less money to spread out into our school districts. And as Margaret pointed out, there is that line where we've been below the appropriate funding. And so, as I said, elections matter. And it's incredibly important that we advocate for appropriate funding here in the state for all of our systems, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural. But I think rules are really taking a hit on this right now. The other parts that we need to pay attention to when we're selecting individuals that will vote for our legislature are things such as vouchers. Being in a rural community, it doesn't make sense to offer funds out of our public education funding for vouchers, because in many rural communities, there is nowhere else to go. There may be a private religious school in close proximity, or it may be quite a ways away. And so when monies are peeled off of our funding stream for vouchers or for tax schemes that allow people to use taxes to pay for private schooling, that hurts our students in our public schools. And so it's incredibly important that we ask what a congressperson or a senator's beliefs are on vouchers or peeling off funding for certain tax incentives, because that truly does hurt our communities. And while in West Des Moines, there may be a number of private schools that students can attend, that's not the case in our rural communities. And so as we peel off money from our rules for a voucher program, then it's directly hurting that community school. Another big issue, and Margaret brought this up, is broadband. I know that our families and our educators are working incredibly hard to make sure that our students are learning if they have to be online virtually. But there are a number of children across our state and a number of employees who do not have access to broadband. And I'm going to give you a little story. I was over in Iowa City last fall, and I was visiting Iowa City schools, and they had received monies from a grant to provide every student in that district a hotspot that they could send home with their Chromebook or their laptop, whatever they were using. And so that really ensured that students could work at home. And this was way before COVID hit. But then I drove down to my hometown of Washington, and I visited some of my friends in my school where I grew up who are teaching. And I said to one of them, you know, I'll be taking some pictures. I'm really proud of what you're doing. Washington has some great education, and I'll be posting it on Facebook. And she said, Mike, I don't have Facebook. I don't have internet capabilities in my home. And she lived outside of Washington, maybe 15 minutes. And so here, this individual couldn't log on to her school's web system in order to access the materials that she needed to maybe prepare for the next day before COVID. And so now individuals who are working in our schools, students who are at home, are having to maybe use their phone as the device to connect and get the information that they need. And there's no excuse for this. We should have broadband access across our entire system. And it is a service that we all should believe that we need to have in place, just as our roads, our fire departments, or police. It is a fundamental service that our communities need to provide. And so again, that's another question to be asking when you're looking at who you'd like to elect to represent you in your community. Another Another topic that Margaret spoke on, but I also want to address it, is the mental health services that we have available in our communities, and tie that with the inequities that a certain population, or all of us, are facing within our schools and across our society. COVID has brought forth the evidence of inequities all across our state. And we need to be making sure that those students who grow up in rural Iowa and may leave that community to go work in an urban, suburban setting, that they have the tools necessary to be fully functioning in society. And so that means fully understanding what the issues are around equity, and what each of us face on a daily basis from whatever perspective we come from. And so as I visited around the state, I have mentioned to some folks who are in our schools that, you know, mental health services are incredibly important, and we need to really be focusing on equity. And people would say to me, Mike, my child is going to stay here in this town. They don't need to learn about various social aspects of our history. And I look at them and I say, do you think your child is going to stay here the rest of their life? Do you want them to maybe get a job where their employment is in a larger environment, and they're going to have to know how to interact in a global society in the 21st century? And so we need to make sure that we have all of those opportunities available for our students all across the board. And rules have a hard time being able to obtain those services because they are already strapped financially, because maybe the community is shrinking because people are moving away. And so we want to make sure that the education that I received in Washington, Iowa, back in 1972 is the same as the students that are graduating today in 2020, but even better and stronger. And so funding just keeps the underlying current of all of this. Another thing that I really want to address when you folks are looking at who to vote for is, as you know, a number of years ago, about 3 or 4, there was a change in our collective bargaining law. And while that may not seem to be directly related to this conversation, in actuality it is. In the growing districts, in the larger districts around the state, they have maintained contractual rights, which are much more enhancing for an individual to go work for them. And so if a school district has reduced to a bare minimum the contract that they have, there are people who are doing district picking by looking at district A, B, and C, and trying to understand where they're going to generate the most revenue for their work and what their benefits are. And so we have developed destination districts in our state. And unfortunately, not all of them are out in the rural communities. And I think that's incredibly important. While it may seem to you as the union president that I'm speaking about collective bargaining and it's a self-serving idea, it really isn't. It is affecting our entire state and getting high quality educators to work in our communities. I want to tie that into benefits. There are individuals who are working in our school districts that have been part of the negotiation process where they have negotiated lower salaries because their insurance costs are going up. And so they're trying to negotiate a lower insurance rate, so they may have to negotiate not as high of a salary. Well, okay, so that makes sense. However, we need to look at what happens in terms of IPERS. If a person doesn't grow in their retirement fund, if their salary doesn't move from 33.5 to 40 in a reasonable amount of time, those years are lost on IPERS. And again, while that may seem self-serving as a union president, it truly isn't, because all of our counties in our state receive a lot of money from the individuals who have worked in the public sector and who have retired. And I'm going to just use Montgomery County, for example, where Vicki Rossander, my good friend, is. Currently in Montgomery County, as of 2018, there are 526 individuals who worked in the public sector who are retired. They bring to that county $8 million. And so if there's a reduction in IPERS, or if we move from the plan that we have to the other plan, which is being presented by a certain group of individuals at our State House, that is going to directly affect the revenues that come into each county. And counties are incredibly dependent on those dollars. And so IPERS is another question that we all need to be asking our elected officials about, on how they feel and what they envision that to be, because it affects each and every one of us who live in this state. For example, I'll say Union County, just to the east of Montgomery. They're about $11 million. Now, I don't know what would happen to Union County if $11 million was to be done and not be flowing into that community. So I think that's incredibly important for us to be understanding and appreciating. Margaret also mentioned busing, and we need to make sure that items like busing aren't just provided for on an annual basis, but they are built into the funding stream. So rural districts know that those dollars are coming in, and they don't have to worry about, oh, maybe the legislature won't appropriate that money 2 years from now. And so again, it goes down to funding, as Margaret had suggested, and that the reason why we're all on here. And I'll just say one more little thing. I think it's incredibly important as we meet with the people who are running for office, ask them, where do they want Iowa to be 10 years from now? And to ask them, if they came from a rural community, what could be taken away from their education in the next 10 years because of the lack of funding, and what disservice would that be to their children or their grandchildren? As I said, we all need to be incredibly proud of the education that we provide our students in our rural communities. But we need to understand that we need to pay for it, and that we need to ensure that large corporations and people who are in the higher tax bracket of our state are paying their share to make sure that we have the workforce that they've moved here to have, and that workforce can come from the rural communities just as it can from the suburbans and the urbans. And so we need to ask our elected officials what their priorities are. And does that priority mean the future of Iowa, and is public education part of that future? There was a question over here. I'm going to go off the topic here just a little bit. But there's a book that I would suggest people read. It's called Democracy in Chains, C-H-I-N-S. And it is a book that helps people understand the longitudinal, systematic demise of public education. And it's incredibly important for people to understand how public education is not as valued as it once was, and that there truly are entities in our society, in our political realm, that are wishing to do away with public education. I would not be where I am today if I didn't have a strong public education background. None of you who are on here, if you didn't have some familiarity with public education, you wouldn't be where you are today. Where do we want our kids to be in 2035? And we need to ensure that public education survives, and that we identify those individuals who are there to do harm to us.
And you bring us right to the question of, where is the value? In healthcare, I know that the quality of the outcomes of the care in a nursing home, let's say, is the direct relationship is between staffing and quality. Is that the same case in education?
Margaret, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I sure would. Yes, the quality of the staffing input is the quality of that teacher in the classroom is the most important factor in the outcome for students. It's not the only factor. The quality of the administration, the principal, and the school leaders comes in second. And the interesting thing to me about that is you can have a really great teacher who can overcome some of the influences at home, but they have to have the resources to do that, right? So we have, when we have this growing poverty all over the state of Iowa, and we've gone from like 20% of our students in poverty back in 2001 to 41%, so it's doubled in, in those 20 years. The resource that it takes to make up for the experiences that kids don't have at home, plus the extraordinary needs associated with any of the trauma that goes along with the poverty experiences that they have, those things require extraordinary effort on the part of our teachers, and our teachers are heroic in trying to meet the needs of those kids. But it takes the whole community to do that. It's not just school that can do that. But once we have that cooperative effort that I think rural districts have in spades, it's the one thing that everybody shows up and takes care of things. But we need to have the essential basic needs met in order to make sure that kids are successful. And it takes a quality teacher with all the supports that teacher needs to deliver that result for children. And to me, that's the most effective investment in breaking the poverty cycle, is to provide the best education you can.
I'm trying to think along the lines of how the money has flowed into schools and how it flows into schools based on our legislative priorities. And Mike, you brought up busing, and that there are some buckets that are available that address transportation. But that, going back to that per diem amount that we talked about per student, is there, that's for the education of the student, or does that address the entire facility as well? Like I've got a 50,000 square foot school, and it's going to need, 50,000 square feet of care, whether I have one student or 100 students. Does that fall into this formula or not?
Again, that this is probably more of Margaret's line of being able to speak, because she'll understand this more, but there are different pots. There is management levy fund, which will take care of certain aspects. There's the general fund. There are other funds, and as we have seen over the past 10 years, 15 years, there's been a peeling off of money from the general funds and put it in specific categories, categorical funding, which is even more in harm's way of the whim of the legislator. They could say, "Oh, we're going to reduce this particular category." Margaret, am I speaking correctly here?
You are. It turns out too that the general fund's not so general, because there are so many categories within the general fund where money has to be spent certain ways.
Right.
So you might rob from Peter to pay Paul. You might take away from the facility funding to pay.
Actually, you can't. This is the tricky thing about this, Glenn, is that it's illegal to use the state penny for school infrastructure and staff costs, for example. And it's illegal to use the physical plant and equipment levy for staff costs.
At the district level, right? But legislators could kind of move
but
things.
legislators could
Right.
go into any of those funds, expand uses, and make it harder to achieve the objectives that they've already required schools to meet, or restrict them. And I think that when you talked about the voucher debate, Mike, I wanted to chime in on that too. I think folks that support vouchers, some of them, and I wouldn't say this is everybody, I think some of them believe that you need to have some competition in schools for schools to be motivated to do the right thing, to deliver for students what we want students to have. And in Iowa, we have so much competition amongst our public schools. I don't know that the extra value of investing in vouchers delivers any value at all, because parents already can open enroll into an neighboring school district. There are 3 different forms of homeschool. In the places that have non-public schools, we have $15 million annually invested in school tuition organization tax credits to pay for tuition for students. The public tax dollar is paying for textbooks and busing in private schools. By the time you look at all of the money that's going into investments in private and homeschool in Iowa, it's something about $70 million, which could go a long way to meeting the needs of our public school students in poverty or our rural school students in needing to have an economy of scale because the per pupil amount isn't sufficient with the sparsity in their community.
I agree with Margaret 100%. That $70 million could be used in so many different ways that would benefit a larger population of individuals. While she was speaking, I thought of a situation where I was in northern Iowa. I tour around the state when I can, a lot. And I was visiting a school in northwest Iowa, and the person who was driving me there, I kept saying, "Where's the school? Where's the school?" And we finally came upon it, and it was right in the middle of a cornfield. And the only other entity that was close to it was a small granary, and it didn't even have a Casey's or a come and go for people to go get necessities that they have. And I said, this is the only thing that these individuals have in this vicinity of this county. And if this school goes under, what are they to do? And I just wanted to say, where are your legislators and why aren't they visiting your schools to see what this building means to your community and to the livelihood of the people who are growing the food for our society that feed into that school? And so again, it's asking what priorities are. There was a question over here that I want to address. How can we bring in the Black Lives Matter? And I know this is a very timely conversation, and a conversation that is one that can get people talking. And Margaret brought up a point of food insecurity and low socioeconomic. And I think we can tie those kind of things into this movement, because I believe it's incredibly important that we treat everyone in our society with the respect and dignity that they deserve, and we give them the rights that are under the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. And we need to recognize that there are segments of our population that have not had the same advantages as Margaret and me, and that we need to make sure that we're highlighting those inequities, that we're teaching our children how to live in our state 35 years from now. Iowa is not going to look like it does today. Iowa looks different than when I was in school back in 1972. I had one African American, one Black American in my class during that whole time I was there. Well, that's changing across our communities. And so we need to understand that embedded in the Black Lives Matter movement, that there are inequities which we as citizens of Iowa need to address, and we need to help our young children understand.
Right. This is unfortunate that we have only so much time, because I'm seeing questions coming through about COVID and how that affects our schools as well. And we're just not going to be able to cover all of these topics. But yeah, Mike, thank you so much for grabbing that out of the feed there, because I think that was absolutely important question, and it kind of feeds into the whole global perspective of what the Rural Caucus is about. The Rural Caucus is every caucus. We're the Black Caucus. We're the Latino Caucus. We are Disability Caucus, because all of these different subsets of the party exist in the rural caucus as well. Now, I'm sure all of those other caucuses would say that they're all caucuses, but I'm pretty sure rural caucus is it. But when talking about education, and your example of that school in the middle of the field brings it back to the global picture of our rural focus. Schools are key entities within a rural setting that determine the success or failure of that community. When people look for homes, one of the first questions they ask in a community is, what are the schools like? And if we're losing students with vouchers to other places, then the quality of our school goes down, right? Our staffing, our ability to staff goes down, our quality of education we can provide goes down. And then our community starts to die along with our school. One of those pillars that we stand on is weakened. So I really appreciated you bringing up the importance of education, not just related to the content to the student, not just related to the income that we generate and retirement and jobs, but that it's truly about the existence of a rural community in many places. So what we've seen with online school, we're seeing it now, this kind of broadening of ability to access schools for students. We're seeing with consolidation, we're seeing more students that are coming into one place. Do consolidation and the rural internet access and online schooling, is that going to affect quality of education? Is that going to affect our rural community's ability to survive?
Margaret, can I answer this real quick? I want to answer the second part. We're learning lots of things through COVID-19 and what it means to have to teach children virtually. And so our educators are getting better day after day because when you think about it, one day they're in school in March and the next day they're at home having to teach virtually, and they didn't have the skill set. No one had ever thought that they would have to do this. So as we continue on through this, we're learning better skills. And one of the problems in rural communities is finding the certified individuals for a particular curricular area. So broadband may be able to online learning, Iowa Learning website that we have here in Iowa, may be able to help provide some of those courses in our rural communities where districts can't afford it or they can't find individuals to fill those positions. And so, as I said, we are learning with COVID. There is something flowing through our state right now where there is conversation about reducing the requirements for licensure for substitute teaching.
Right.
And while there was maybe some general thinking that our schools will be under the water level in terms of personnel, and so reducing the licensure requirements for this year could be a good thing. Well, we have yet to see that, but there is a movement now to make that a permanent situation. And while that looks okay, there are going to be consequences of that, because if there's an individual who has to be in a long-term maternity leave and they hire a person who doesn't have the certification to teach in that school, and they're going to be there for 8 weeks or longer, that's going to lead to the detriment of those children's education. With the reduction in licensure accreditation for substitutes, there will be possibly some districts who will use that to hire a math teacher that they can't find. And so while the quick fix Band-Aid looks like it may be advantageous, it really has long-term consequences. And that relates to the COVID right now, because that's come out during this pandemic. Margaret, I'm sorry I talked too much. Was there something that you wanted to add to that question, Margaret?
Well, a couple of things. First, I'm going to build on what you just said, Mike. The other side of that equation, and I understand why people are asking for the relief on the certification, because the underfunding of schools for such a long time has made it impossible to attract teachers for certain certification areas. We have shortage areas at almost every secondary level, math and science, but they're not the only ones anymore. I mean, even finding a music teacher, all of the foreign language teaching positions, the special ed anywhere. And because you have all of those shortages, I think if we put adequate resources into schools so that we could pay a competitive market wage, we would no longer see that. But we have it right now. So if they don't address that and they have to spend more of their budget to attract somebody there to fill the math position, it's at the expense of other curricular offerings that are not mandated in law, because they don't have enough to do both, right? So Do they hire a sub who is a para, who already knows the district, would need some special treatment because they don't have the right certification, and keep the art teacher? Or do they try and find somebody who meets the certification and no longer be able to provide that position that kids really need access to? And I feel so badly for decision-making entities that are struggling with these tough choices right now because they don't have the resources. So when you started to say elections matter, I mean, I think the first question everybody should be asking is, how important is public education to you? And are you willing to invest in it even more than you are in tax relief of any kind? Because that's been the equation. We've been cutting taxes and not providing enough resource for education.
I hate, it's 7:57. I hate that that's such a great wrap up, though. It comes down to what you value. Do you value education or do you not? We have several candidates and elected officials who are on with us today, and I hope they had the opportunity to hear that and digest that, and I hope people take questions to them. Before we started, Mike and I were just talking briefly about the importance of these roles all the way down to the county supervisor role in terms of paying for, setting those levies on property tax, and then the state legislators doing their job of making sure that the state portion of money is provided and increased in the appropriate way. So I hope they all take that away. Mike, Margaret, thank you so much both for being here. You are absolutely coming back, whether you want to or not, because we clearly have more to learn from you all. Again, thank you to Jackie Steiber-Cordone and to Judy Kading and Vicki Rosander for organizing this. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank Pat Shipley on the side here, because I know she's a former associate with the ISEA who's really plugged in some good stuff in our questions here. Again, stay safe, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for having us. Good to see you again, Mike.
Take care. Good to see you, Margaret.
Nice to meet you both. Thank you.